It's nice to be here. That was the typical way they started church services when we were in Zimbabwe, and it only took me 3 months to figure out that was English. It's nice to be here. Actually, if you said it in Shona, it sounds like Jakanaka Kuvapano, and I could have figured that out, but the English I had trouble with. Tonight, we're going to try to finish off Joseph. And we've got a lot of stuff to cover, so instead of going through my usual brilliant introduction that has you sitting on the edge of your seats wondering what's going to happen next, I'm just going to start telling you the story. And the story is this. You remember a couple of weeks ago, we left Joseph in the dungeon, right? He was sitting there. He had interpreted the dreams for the baker and the cupbearer. And he said, when you get back to the Pharaoh, remember me. And nothing happened. And he's sitting there for 2 years. Well, finally, the Pharaoh has a dream. He's troubled by this. It's not working right, and he doesn't know what to do. So he calls his magicians and his wise men, and he says, I had this dream. What is it? And they couldn't answer it. And then suddenly, the cupbearer remembers, oh, there was a guy in the dungeon, and he interpreted my dream, so maybe we should check him out. So they go and get Joseph, and they clean him up. You know, he's been in the dungeon. And they present him to Pharaoh. And Joseph interprets the dream, and the problem is solved. And in Genesis 41, it says 41 verse 39. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there's no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. Now, you know that story, right? Did that strike you as unusual? I mean, you're all sitting here with our spiritual glasses on thinking, well, of course, I know the story of Joseph. I know where he fits in God's plan. That was a very natural thing to have happen, right? No. That's a ridiculous thing to happen. That's an amazing thing to happen. Let me tell you how the story really went, all right? Now, a cupbearer is not just like your wine steward at your typical restaurant. I've never been to a restaurant that had wine stewards, and if I did, they wouldn't pay much attention to me anyway. But his job was not just to make sure that Pharaoh's cup was filled with the good stuff. See, pharaohs never lost elections because they didn't have elections. If you didn't like the pharaoh, you either waited till he died or you did something about it. So one way of getting rid of the pharaoh was getting an army together, going to battle, and defeating him in battle and either killing him or chasing him out of the country. The other way to get rid of the Pharaoh was to be a little sneaky. And one of the more convenient ways of being sneaky was to poison him. So the cupbearer's job wasn't just to fill up the Pharaoh's cup. The cupbearer's job was to make sure whatever he put in the cup didn't hurt the Pharaoh. And guess how he usually had to do that? He had to taste it first. So this cupbearer had a very intimate and interdependent relationship with the Pharaoh. Right? Now, the last time Joseph saw the cupbearer, what did he say? Remember me to Pharaoh. And between the dungeon and the palace, the cupbearer forgot all about him for 2 years. Strange, because Pharaoh had dreams. Now, what do you think about dreams? How often do you dream? Every night? In fact, do you realize that people who study these things say that we tend to sleep in 1.5 hour cycles, 1.5 hour cycles, and near the end of every 1.5 hour cycle, we have a period of intense dreaming. So if you sleep 7.5 hours at night, 5 times every night, you have dreams. Now, if the Pharaoh and his cupbearer were that close together, that interdependent for 2 years, and Pharaoh dreamed every night, do you think it's going to be 2 years before Pharaoh mentions a dream to his cupbearer? But he didn't think of Joseph. He didn't think of Joseph. Now, on top of that, it's only been in the last 300 or 400 years that we've become so sophisticated, we thought that we got here by ourselves. Up until the last 300 or 400 years, everybody thought that God or gods were responsible for the human beings on this planet. And so most of the rulers, although they were pretty pumped up about it, I mean, the Pharaoh thought he was kind of a demigod, but they still looked to God or gods for direction on how things should be run. And so a very common way of getting direction from God or the gods was through dreams. How often do we read in the Bible that God gave instructions to his people through dreams? Okay, so the Pharaoh had a whole stable. He had a front bench and back bench and a party room full of professional dream interpreters. And so he has these two troubling dreams, and he says to them, tell me what it means. Does it make sense to you that not one of those could tell him what the dream meant? I mean, don't you think that these pros would at least come up with something that he would buy? But this time, nothing. And then the cupbearer says, oh, by the way, there's a guy in your dungeon that interpreted a dream for me 2 years ago. Let's see what he has to say. By the way, he's a foreigner. He's a Hebrew. He's not from around here. So Joseph comes in and he gives him the interpretation. And the interpretation is this. The 7 fat cows that come up and eat the grass on the side of the Nile River, they're 7 years of plenty. And then the 7 skinny cows that come up and eat them, they're 7 years of famine. And God gave you they gave you 2 dreams, but they mean the same thing because he wanted to make sure you got the point. The 7 plump, healthy ears of grain are again 7 years, and the 7 withered, dried up heads of grain that come up and eat them are 7 years of famine. And so after that, he says, now, there's your interpretation. Now, okay, why would he believe Joseph? First of all, why would he even listen to Joseph? I mean, he's a foreigner that's a prisoner in the dungeon. So now, when you listen to the accents of some of the people in prominent roles in Australia, you begin to think, well, it doesn't mean anything when you're a foreigner. Anybody can be anybody here. But that's not the way it always has been, and it's not the way in most of the rest of the world. For those of us who are old enough to remember guys like Muammar Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein, guess who his inner circle was? It was his relatives. Guess who his bodyguard was? People from his tribe or his village. In that day and age, the Pharaoh of Egypt is going to get some prisoner from Canaan in to tell him his dreams? Does that make sense to you? Oh, I know. Maybe it was because they had this long and trusting relationship. Over the years, the Pharaoh and Joseph had come to know and respect each other, and Pharaoh was convinced of Joseph's loyalty, right? How long had the Pharaoh even known that Joseph existed? A few hours? Never even heard of him before that. Oh, I know. Maybe it was Joseph's reputation as a dream interpreter. You know, he'd heard about him and he says, you're spot on. How many, as far as we know at this point, how many dreams had Joseph interpreted? 4? 2 years ago, he interpreted 2 dreams and got them spot on. The baker was executed. The cupbearer was restored to his role. When did he interpret 2 other dreams? 13 years before this, when he told his brothers, he had dreamed about his brothers and his parents bowing down to him. Had that happened yet? So here he is. He's got a 50% track record. Would that be convincing to Pharaoh? But what about the dream itself? Was it something that you could check out and see if it was going to happen? You know, could you do some background research or do some statistical analysis? Think about what his interpretation of this dream said. He said, 7 years of plenty. How long is it going to be before they have any clue whether he knows what he's talking about? It's going to be at least that first harvest. And then even after 5 or 6 or 7 harvests, how are they going to know that that's Joseph's God? And notice when the Pharaoh said, can you interpret this dream? Joseph resisted an urge that not many of us would have been able to resist. I mean, when you think it's Joseph's ticket out of the dungeon and the Pharaoh's asking him, don't you think he's going to say, sure, Pharaoh, I got you covered. I can do it. What does he say? He says, it's not me that interprets dreams. It's my God. But here's this dream. How does Pharaoh know for the first 4, 5, 6 years, even if they're bountiful harvest, how does he know that it's not the Egyptian gods that are suddenly pleased with what they're doing and they're having a bountiful harvest because of that? So then 7 years of bounty, then you start with the famine. And after a few years, well, how do we know? So you have to have the 7 years of famine. And then at the end of that, things are going to return to normal. So Joseph interprets a dream for him that it's going to take 15 years at least to know if he knows what he's talking about. Now, don't you think you would trust this guy? You've known him for all of 3 hours. He's a foreigner, he spent the last few years in a dungeon, and he interprets a dream for you. It says, the fate of your nation for the next 15 years rests on these dreams. Wouldn't you trust him? Oh, I know. While Joseph was in the dungeon, he didn't have a lot of else to do. So he put out a CV. He was circulating it, see if he could get another job. And maybe Pharaoh had run across his CV. So he says, well, I noticed you weren't born in Egypt. How did you get here? Well, you see, my dad had children by 4 different women, but my mom was the favorite, so I was his favorite, and he treated me a little special. Well, how did that get you to Egypt? Well, my brothers didn't like it. And when my dad sent me to check on them, I just told them the truth. They weren't doing a very good job, and they liked it even less. And then my God sent me a dream and said that your brothers are going to bow down to you, and I made the mistake of telling my brothers that, and they liked that even less. Wait a minute, you interpreted that dream? How did that one work out for you? Well, it hadn't worked out yet, but it's coming. Okay, so but still, how did you get in Egypt? Well, eventually my brothers got so mad, they sold me as a slave to a bunch of Ishmaelites. Okay, that's how you got to Egypt. You came to Egypt as a slave. How did you end up in the dungeon? Well, I was bought by Potiphar, the captain of your guard, and he was okay. I worked hard. I learned to speak Egyptian and learned the routine in the household and progressed. And while I was doing this, Mrs. Potiphar noticed me. And how did you get in the dungeon? Well, she kept on, and finally she made a big play for me. I wouldn't go for it. Potiphar got mad. She lied about it. Potiphar got mad and threw me in the dungeon. And you did nothing to cause this, right? I mean, your brothers hated you, but you were totally innocent. You ended up in a dungeon because of Potiphar's wife, but you didn't do anything wrong. And you're 50% on your dreams. Well, what about your work experience? Well, I was a spoiled rich kid to start with. And then when I was 17, I was a slave. I worked real hard, and I did a pretty good job as a slave. Made it to the top of the household, and now I was in the dungeon, and they put me in charge of the dungeon. Oh, so what does Pharaoh say? You're hired. The fate of the most wealthy and powerful and influential country in the world rests on this guy who has spent his life as a spoiled kid, a slave, and a prisoner in a dungeon. And the most powerful human being on this planet says, I'm going to make you the second most powerful human being on this planet. Only on the throne am I more powerful than you. Everything else, everybody has to do what you say, and the fate of my country for the next 15 years is in your hands. Does that make sense to you? Doesn't that sound a little outrageous to you? Why would anybody do that? Why? It's ridiculous. You know why? Well, God was in it. You see, when God gets ready to act, statistics and probability don't matter. God does what God does when it's time to do it. What was important now was that Joseph responded the way he did to the challenges and the trials he faced. But the reason it happened when it did the way it did was it was God's time and he was ready. So wherever you are, I don't know if you're on your way to Egypt as a slave. I don't know if you're still living in the household with abusive family members. I don't know if you're working your way up the ladder in slavery, or if you're being tempted by Potiphar's wife, or if you're in the dungeon waiting for that silly cupbearer to remember me. I don't know where you are, but I do know that when it's time, God will act. And just like it did for Joseph, I mean, we know the story, we expected it to happen, but when you look at it the way it really was for the people who were there at the time, that's a ridiculous thing to have happen, and yet it did happen that way because it was God's timing, and God made it happen. You're hired. From slave to the second most powerful human being on the planet, just like that. And that's what happens when it's God's time. Now, I'll tell you this. I don't know if anybody in this room is ever going to be the second most powerful human being on this planet, or even the second most powerful human being in Australia. And if Dave Spears isn't here tonight, we probably won't be the second most powerful person in South Australia. But when God gets ready to act, it'll happen. His timing is perfect, and he does what he needs to do. Now, why would he do that? Why would that ever happen? Why would God pick Joseph? Can you point to something in Joseph's life that would have made that likely or even possible? Well, the first thing you have to remember is Joseph did not develop his character based on his circumstances. Your circumstances can help to shape your character and can demonstrate your character, but it's your response to your circumstances that develops your character. And Joseph had horrendous circumstances, but his response was always what he needed to be, so God could trust him to respond properly. Now, can God trust you in a difficult situation to respond properly? Now, if of all the areas where Joseph responded properly, can you think of one that might have been the key to why God could trust him with that much responsibility? What might have been the key? It could have been patience, endurance, perseverance. I mean, how old was he when he had the dream? He was 17 years old. How old was he when he stood before Pharaoh? He was 30 years old. How old was he when his brothers finally showed up and bowed down to him? He was 39 years old. So Joseph waited 22 years for the fulfillment of that dream. Moses, he was 40 years old when he killed the Egyptian and had to leave Egypt. How old was he when he came back? He was 80 years old. 40 years he spent. Paul, between the time of his conversion and the time of his first missionary journey, was probably about 17 years. We won't talk about Noah, 400 years. You know, he was 400 years old when he started building the ark. But you see, patience, perseverance is a pretty good thing. Was that Joseph's primary trait? No, he probably had some other skills too. Obviously, he was a gifted administrator. Everywhere he went, he ended up in charge of things. So that was good. And in spite of how he seemed to get along with his brothers and Mrs. Potiphar, he must have had pretty good people skills because apart from that, people seemed to get along with him pretty well. Was that his primary characteristic? What do you think was most important? I'll give you a hint. From Genesis 42 to the end of the book of Genesis you're dealing with that issue. The issue that Joseph had that probably set him apart from others. You know what it was? He could forgive. He could forgive. He wrestles with it. Philip Yancey, you know, What's So Amazing About Grace and the Jesus I Never Knew, written a lot of books. He's written about Joseph, and he says this. Personally, I've heard a lot of sermons on the last few chapters of Genesis where people are trying to explain all the stuff that Joseph did. You know, his brothers came in to buy grain, and he recognizes them. They don't recognize him. He accuses them of being spies, and he says until they bring their younger brother Benjamin, because Jacob wouldn't let Benjamin go with them to buy the grain. He says, until they come, I'm not going to let you. I'm not going to give you your grain. I think you're spies. Prove it. And so they leave their older brother Simeon, and they go back, and then he puts their money back in their sack, and then they come again and they bring Benjamin, and then he puts his silver cup in Benjamin's sack, and then he brings them in. And you know, there may have been some element of testing in what Joseph was doing, but I think the real issue was, could he forgive them? Could he forgive his brothers for doing what they did to him so that he was where he was? And think about this. Think about the number of people that Joseph was now in a position to get even with. Think about the cupbearer. Now, the cupbearer didn't set out to do him any bad deal, but really, Joseph spent maybe an extra couple of years in that dungeon because the cupbearer had a bad memory. Don't you think Joseph, in his new position, should at least do something to help him improve his memory? Well, he didn't, as far as we know. What about Potiphar? Potiphar bought him as a slave. When Mrs. Potiphar made this horrendous accusation, don't you think that Potiphar should have at least suspected it enough to talk to Joseph about it instead of just throwing him in the dungeon? So maybe Joseph should do something to remind Potiphar to be a little more careful before he starts throwing people in jail. Oh, and what about Mrs. Potiphar? Oh, my goodness. I mean, she's a piece of work. Why doesn't, now he is over her husband in the food chain. Why doesn't he do something about that? And yet, as far as we know, he didn't do a thing. But wait, his brothers, what have his brothers done to him? 17 years he lived with them, and they were not very nice to him. And the only reason they were no longer not nice to him is because they figured out a way to make the rest of his life not nice without them even having to be involved. They sold him as a slave. He had already spent, at this point, when his brothers come back, he's now 39 years old. He spent 22 years in Egypt, and his brothers are there, and think about this. Even though he is now, Joseph is a very powerful, wealthy, influential person, in effect, he is still just a slave. He's a very rich and powerful slave, but he's still a slave because he can't leave Egypt. He can't change jobs. The Pharaoh has him where he wants him. He's not going anywhere. He's rich and he's powerful, but he's still just a slave. And it's because of what his brothers did to him. And now he has a chance to get even with them. Who could resist that? What does he do? What does he do? Well, in order to get a handle on forgiveness, I think it might be important to talk about some things that it's not, because sometimes we have a lot more trouble forgiving than we need to because we don't really understand what it is. Now, the first thing I want to tell you is what it's not conceding that they're right. Sometimes we think if we forgive someone, we're somehow acknowledging that maybe what they did wasn't so bad and it's really kind of okay. Was what his brothers did to him okay? Is it all right to be that abusive and then sell somebody as a slave? Was it all right for Mrs. Potiphar to do what she did? No. So you can forgive without any acknowledgement that what they did was right or even pardonable. It's not up to them. That's not a condition of forgiveness. So when you forgive somebody, you're not really, as far as God's concerned, you're not letting them off the hook. You're just reconciling yourself to them. You're letting go of something. Now, also, forgiveness doesn't necessarily mean you're immediately going to let them do it again. You can forgive immediately, but when trust is destroyed, it might take a while to rebuild it. Now, sometimes it will mean putting them in the same position again, but that's not automatic. When someone has betrayed your trust, when someone has harmed you, it doesn't necessarily mean that because you've forgiven them, you're immediately going to let them be in the position to do it again. Doesn't mean that. Another thing is, forgiveness is not an emotion. It's not an emotion. Because what are we told to do? Anybody in here ever prayed the Lord's Prayer? Do you know what you prayed when you prayed the Lord's Prayer? Forgive us our debts, forgive us our trespasses, forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. You want God to forgive you exactly the way you're willing to forgive others? Well, that's a tough one. If it were an emotion, could we be that forthright with it? You see, you don't have to wait until you feel good about that person to forgive them. You can forgive them without feeling good about it. It's not about how you feel. Hopefully, see, our emotions are good indicators, but we can train our emotions. To some extent, we can control our emotions. And they're indicators, not dictators. We are not required to respond according to our emotional inclinations. It's important to listen to them, but it's also important not to be dictated to by them. Now, it's not an emotion. Now, the other thing, it doesn't mean forgetting, and I want to maybe play with words a little bit, but the concepts are very important, because to forget is not the same thing as choosing not to remember. Think about this for all you people with a theological mindset. Do you think God can actually forget anything? Is God capable of forgetting? No, I kind of don't think so. How can somebody who knows everything forget anything? But he can choose not to remember. And in doing that, what you're saying is, I am choosing not to act as if it was still an issue. You see, when Joseph had a chance to have revenge on his brothers, had he forgotten what they'd done? But he chose not to remember, in that he chose not to act as if he still owed them something to get even. See, so you don't necessarily have to forget everything that's happened to you. You can choose not to remember it. You can choose not to act as if it's still an issue. That's what it's not. Now, what is it? First of all, it's a choice you can make. And it's something, sometimes we kind of think that we can't forgive anybody if they don't ask my forgiveness. Believe it or not, you can forgive somebody who's never asked for it. In fact, probably a lot of the people we feel like we need to forgive don't even realize that we think we need to forgive them for anything. So if we're waiting for them to ask forgiveness, we're gonna have a lot of hurt that we're carrying around that they don't even know about. So it's a choice you can make even if the other person doesn't acknowledge the wrong. It'll free you up. In fact, if you want to know the best definition I can think of for forgiveness, it's letting go. It's letting go. Can you forgive someone? Can you let go? First off, you let go of the right to be bitter. Now, did Joseph have the right to be bitter when you consider what he had been through? Yeah. From starting with his family and going all the way, he could be bitter with God. Look what God let have happen to him. And yet, in forgiveness, you let go of the right to harbor bitterness. You also let go of the right to get revenge. You see, in fact, if we really understood the severity of the wrath of God, we wouldn't even worry about our petty attempts at revenge. We would be fearful for the other person for what the judgment of God might be like. We don't need revenge. You choose not to remember. You don't pursue revenge. Leave that up to God. And finally, you have to stop revisiting it. I will speak. In married life, you have to forgive a lot. Especially my wife, she has to forgive a lot. But when you truly forgive, you don't bring it up again. You know, the next time there's a little bit of friction, well, if you've forgiven me, you can't say that. See, do you do that? Do you? And I'll tell you this, you know the old thing, Romans 12, present your bodies as a living sacrifice. You know the preacher joke, what's the problem with a living sacrifice? It keeps crawling off the altar. You knew that? Okay, well, forgiving can be the same way. You can forgive, but then again you think, yeah, but. No, have to let go of it again. You might have to let go of it a lot, day after day after day. But that's what forgiveness is. And Joseph forgave. God could, if God ever wants to use us in a prominent position, guess who are the prime targets for criticism, for manipulation, for anger and frustration? Anyone in a leadership role. You know the tall poppy syndrome. Who gets shot at? The tall poppy get their head cut off. Okay, when you assume a leadership role, people are gonna my wife just talks about it as having a target on your back or your front or all over. But you're a target, and people are gonna do things for the wrong reasons or do the wrong thing for the right reason. But it will hurt, and if you cannot forgive, you will struggle in any role where God wants to promote you. And Joseph could forgive. But how could he do that? Why would you bother doing that? I mean, why would you give up the right to get mad at somebody for doing something they shouldn't do? In fact, why would you give up the right to get even with them? Why would you do that? We looked at this last week. Let's look at it again. It's worth looking at more than once. Genesis 45. Genesis 45. His brothers have come. This is great. Verse 3, Joseph said to his brothers, I'm Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Can you imagine how it's reversed? 10 big brothers picking on one little guy, and all of a sudden, this one little guy has the might of Egypt behind him, and you're begging for food, and he's in charge? Yeah, I'd be kind of scared too. In fact, one of the things is, a problem we often have is we expect other people to react the way we would in the same situation. What had they done to Joseph? What did they expect Joseph to do to them? What they had done to him. See, that's our default setting, is we expect other people to respond the way we would. And that was why they were terrified, because they knew what they had been like. But then Joseph said, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there's been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will not be plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me a father to Pharaoh, Lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me Lord over all Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay. See, God did it. Now, anybody here can recite Romans 8:28? What does it say? All things work together for good. Now, here's the thing. Does God, I'm not a very good Calvinist sometimes. Does God cause all things, including the bad things? Is that God's fault? No, it doesn't say God causes all things. It doesn't say that all things are good. It says God can make good out of all things. So as much as you can't condone Joseph's brothers for what they did, you can't condone Mrs. Potiphar for what she did, but what you have to admit is that when God gets ready to act, he makes something good out of it, and he did. God did it. So if you don't believe that you can trust your life, your future, your horrible circumstances to God, then don't forgive and do the best you can. But if you believe that God is good, if you believe that he has your best interest at heart, and if you believe he really is in control, then you can trust him. Then you can forgive because it's up to God. It's up to God. Now, we've spent 4 weeks on Joseph, so I have 4 things I want you to remember. 4 things about Joseph. First one, it's not your circumstances that matter, it's your response to your circumstances. We all face daily things that are not within our control, things that are beyond anything that we can manage or even cope with. So it's not about that, it's our response to that. You see, we get focused on the result and we want to accept responsibility for the end product, but we don't really want to fool with what happens in between. God says it's the other way around. He says, I will accept responsibility for the end product. You have to cooperate with the process. It's how you respond to your circumstances. And Joseph responded the way he was supposed to, and that's why God could trust him with the responsibility he gave him. It's not about your circumstances, it's about your response. It's always too soon to give up. It's always too soon to give up. Joseph could have given up before he ever got sold as a slave because his family life was a little bit of a mess. He could have given up on the way to Egypt. He could have given up at Potiphar's house when he had to learn how to be a slave. He could have given up when Mrs. Potiphar went after him. He could have given up when the cupbearer forgot him. He never gave up. He could have given up and just gone his own way and gotten even with his brothers when they showed up. But he never gave up. He pursued God's plan the whole way. You don't know where you're at in the story. See, the problem with living life is, at best, we can only begin to understand it after it's over and we look back. Problem is, we have to make decisions while we're going through it, and that's hard. So don't give up if it's hard going through it, because you won't know what it's going to be like until you get to the end and look back. Joseph never gave up. Next thing, remember what a ridiculous thing. Pharaoh takes a foreign slave out of a dungeon and in just a few hours promotes him to the second most powerful person in the world. When God gets ready to do it, it will happen. As unexpected and as unlikely and as unpredictable as it might be, when it's time, it will happen. And finally, along the way, it's going to be rough and people are going to treat you poorly from time to time. Sometimes, like Joseph and his brothers, sometimes the people closest to you who should be the most help to you are going to damage you the most. Can you forgive them? Can you forgive? So 4 things. It's not your circumstances, it's your response. It's always too soon to give up. At the right time, God will do what needs to be done. And along the way, you've got to learn to forgive. Okay? Let me pray. Father, we do thank you for the message of the life of Joseph. Thank you for what a godly example he is. Thank you that we have your Spirit living in us to give us guidance, encouragement, protection. Father, I pray for all of us, for my brothers and sisters here, that you would help us to cope with the challenges we face. Help us to live godly lives in a world that is not interested in you. Help us to respond properly, to not give up, to look to you for the timing, and to learn how to forgive like you've forgiven us. For Jesus' sake, amen.